Kellyk.
Just want to check to make sure the mic's on. Can people hear me? Great. I might have been called up here because I wrote a book about how machines are becoming biological. You can kind of see that. And John Seeley Brown earlier, a couple days ago, mentioned that I had this idea of zillionics, of how we need to deal with zillions of things. But I'm not going to talk about either of those things. I'm going to talk about something that Danny Hillis had mentioned earlier in passing. Maybe if I could have my computer on. Remember those oaks that Danny talked about, the oaks of New College that had been planted many centuries before they actually needed the oaks. A couple interesting things about that you want to know, and that is not so much that they had foresight, how they had the foresight, but how they remembered that they had them. And so I think it's a very important problem, and particularly in the kind of telescoping, narrow sense of the now that we have. We're not thinking very far into the future. We go a couple of years into the future. We don't have a very good sense of the past. If you look up any book, say the book's out here for sale, and look in the bibliography, most of the citations are probably within the last 5 years. So we have this really narrow sense of 5 years in the past and 5 years in the future. So I don't think that's good enough, and particularly as we try and make the civilization that we want to make. We need to think in the longer term. And so I've been researching long-term projects, long-term plans, and right now I want to focus on one aspect of that that's often taken as a joke, but I think it's actually very interesting, and that is time capsules. They are basically messages to the future. They are things that people in the present now send to sometime in the future. And it's very interesting because by and large, this is a completely invisible, or if not completely kind of humorous activity, but it's actually very important. And in some senses, what the oaks of New College were kind of a time capsule. This is a time capsule that actually was buried by Samson, a department of theirs that made fabrics, and they buried a very elaborate time capsule. Not all of them are as elaborate as that, but they can be. And I should make some distinction right away what a time capsule is. There are a lot of things that in Egypt, Mesopotamia, they used to bury in foundations. They would have a ceremony when they made a building, and they would deposit things into the foundation and then have a big ceremony that was later turned into the things that the Masonics did, cornerstones. George Washington actually buried a cornerstone, put things inside the Capitol building. But these things are separate from time capsules because they are sealed but unscheduled retrieval. And what I'm mostly talking about are those that are sealed and have a scheduled retrieval time. So there is a kind of a deliberate sense of the future. There are almost rituals that we have right now. The interesting thing about time capsules in America is that the best guesses are that there are between 10,000 and 100,000 of them right now. I'm estimating that there's close to a time capsule on average buried every hour in America. We don't know about them. Nobody's telling them to do this. I mean, there's no political campaign. There's no movement. It's almost like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. People get this urge suddenly to make a time capsule. And this is an example, a picture of one they're often done in high schools, corporations, associations do these things, and if you start to notice them, you'll see them everywhere. This happens to be one at a campus. But again, between 10,000 and 100,000 of them being built. 95% of them are completely lost track of within a decade of their being buried. We do that and then we forget about them. And this is the problem, is that there's great intentions, but actually being able to remember it is a real problem. And this is a severe problem because I'll explain how it becomes a problem. It becomes a problem in terms of having institutional memories, of deciding to do a long-term project over generations. How do you transmit that intent? How do you transmit the purpose? And so it's a very rare thing. This is a kind of a rare picture of actually someone opening a time capsule. That is a great big soldering iron. And this is a capsule that was buried by Atwell Kent, the radio maker. And it was a big copper box. It was sealed, an inert gas, nitrogen inside, and they had a great big copper soldering iron that they were unloading, and there was some mint condition radios inside and other kind of paraphernalia. But this is actually a rare occurrence of someone actually opening a time capsule. Right now, you can buy commercially made time capsules. These are some of them. There's dozens and dozens of companies selling time capsules to all these hundreds of thousands of people burying time capsules. And they range in price between $50 and $500, depending on what you want. They range from, the one up in the right upper corner is sort of, basically it's a chest, and they give you a lock, and the lock has no key or combination. You hack it when you want to open it. And then they have things like, trivial things for weddings and babies, which is where a lot of these time capsules are. They're kind of very, very small. But then they have sophisticated stainless steel ones and so forth. These are the dates that I took. I did some searching and found newspaper clippings of time capsule burials, and I just took the first about dozen and a half dates of when they were going to be opened. And there they are. And isn't that a pathetic list? To me, it's pathetic because basically they're all within 100 years. This is as far as people can think. There's one exception there, but basically 100 years within a lifetime almost of an individual. They're not very far, maybe the second generation. And I'm much more interested in things to the seventh generation, or certainly to the third and beyond. And it turns out that when you do an analysis of all the time capsules that are out there are two kinds. There are centennial time capsules and the millennial time capsules. And the millennial time capsules basically take this slice of life, a little snapshot of the institution or the person's life, and they kind of put it in. And as I said, there's between 10 and 100,000 of them. And then there's millennial time capsules, which go 1,000 years and beyond. And as far as we know, we have records of, there's only 8 of them. What's really interesting is that there's almost none in between. There's almost no 500-year time capsules. I don't figure this out why, but there's something about that round numbers, and there aren't very few in between. But what's another interesting thing about the millennial time capsules is that they're more microcosmic. They intend, in a more systematic way, to take a representation of the culture at large. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the millennial time capsules that we know about. Here are the dates. There's only 7 there because I'm missing one of the dates. I haven't figured it out yet. It's actually, I think, buried at MIT somewhere. But you can see the dates. The ones that have 2 after it means that there's actually 2 separate time capsules that are going to be retrieved at those dates. The one that I'm most interested in is the one for 8,000 years. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. That is called the Crypt of Civilization. And it was sealed in 1940. And it lies under a very unassuming campus hall on a small university outside of Atlanta called Oglethorpe University. And this is a room that's 10 by 10 by 20. It's sort of a pyramid shape inside. It's completely sealed with a great big stainless steel door that's been welded shut. And inside, as you can see, is a complete, amazing microcosm of 1940. There are 800 volumes of books. 200 of them are fiction, but they're on metallic microfilm. Okay, it's little thin strips of metal that have been etched, and there's dolls with costumes. There's I wanted to read a little bit list of the kinds of items that are in it in a minute. But this is the Crypt of Civilization, and what's interesting, of course, is the date, which is 8,113. Where did that date come from? I mean, that's to me, when I saw it, it was like, this is a crank, the specificity of that date. But where it came from was, in fact, an estimate of when the Egyptian calendar began, which was about 4,000 years ago. And so, 4,000 BC, which made it about 6,000 years ago. And so, what the guy did was just flip it into the forward, the same distance that he thought civilization had come in the past. So it was about 6,000 years in the past, and he added the 6,000 years to it was loaded in 1938 and sealed in 1940, and that's where he came up with this date of 8,000 years. And so there's an interesting symmetry to that. And it's still a little bit kind of cultural centric in the assumption that we are sort of in the middle of things. But nonetheless, what's interesting is the other dates that I showed for those other millennial time capsules were independently basically arrived at with the same kind of logic. There are two buried in Japan that they also did the same kind of thing. They just picked different dates for when civilization had begun. What's interesting to me was that what we're after is to try to get a sense of that long now. The sense that we have a very long past and we have a long future, rather than the very short now of 5 years in the past and 5 years into the future. Now, we don't need to get 10,000 years in our minds all the time, but we certainly can expand our sense of the now. Going back to the crypto civilization, the kinds of things that are in it, there's just amazing stuff. One of the things it says on the plaque on the outside is, this is the crypt, the civilization representing a culture at the last half of the 20th century. There are no precious metal or gold inside. However, there's a complete Lionel model train set from 1940. Which is probably worth far more than any gold that could have been in there. There's Lincoln logs, there's a telephone instrument dial, there's pencil paintings, drinking glass holders, there's a sample of catalinite. I have no idea what it is, but it's there. Electric lighting fixtures. I mean, there's an entire set, long list of every possible object. And what's also interesting, again, is, and I'll explain a little bit about this, some of the assumptions of how people were to use this. Well, first of all, they didn't assume that English would be spoken. So there's the thing up here is called a musoscope. It's basically kind of those little arcade hand crank things that had a flip book of objects in the English words, and there was a phonograph record that also could be powered by hand that you would play along with it. There was correspondence, so it would teach you English. Okay. Now they also had another part of it that they have some movies that are on movies that are on film in these canisters, which are in glass and in nitrogen sealed. But they have a projector, but they didn't assume that there would be electricity. So they have a generator that's powered by a windmill inside. So that if you needed electricity, you could use that. There's a lot of cultural representation and cultural bias, of course, in this. This is a list I pulled off of some of the contents of the two Japanese time capsules that were buried in Expo 70. And it's a little hard to read, but there's some very strange things. Rice cookers. There's a model of the Shinkansen train, and the next one is a pencil sharpener. I mean, it's just great stuff. There's stethoscopes. There's men's and women's wrist watches, as well as false teeth. There's all kinds of strange stuff. But another kind of thing, again, I mentioned this open-ended time capsule not really being a time capsule, but the things that we sent into space with Voyager, the plaque that everybody knows about of the guy and the woman with the hand. What's interesting is that there's a complete set of phonograph records and records that have more than just that plaque. There's a photographic library. There's some contents of books. There's music of people singing. There's also natural sounds of animals. And as an example of a good way to kind of represent what the culture was about, this is actually they did a really good job of trying to convey things, because they were trying to talk to aliens who had no assumptions at all. So they're trying to transmit knowledge about the human species, but actually they did a pretty good job of conveying all kinds of other knowledge. And I wanted to show you a couple of things that people haven't seen from that. Again, there's no scheduled reception of this, but I have a little bit more than that. Here's an example of it's a picture of traffic in India, and it's a pretty good sense of what we had at the time this was launched. Again, this has been coated onto gold-plated copper discs. Here's another interesting, from a design point of view, how do you transmit information about who we are? This applies to dinosaurs, by the way, as well as humans. Especially it's a fertilization. They're giving some sense of how big these things are. Here's another great design problem of conveying human knowledge. This is about what we know about chemistry. How do you do that without any kind of words? So these are museums of human knowledge and knowledge that we're trying to transmit to a future species. This is a diagram of the Westinghouse time capsule. This is where the word time capsule was first invented. It was buried in 1939 at the World's Fair. It was originally going to be called a time bomb. But somebody had the great idea of changing the name, and the name stuck. So we have time capsule. It's 7.5 feet long, weighs 200 pounds. How do we remember where to build time capsules? If they keep being forgotten, how do we remember how to do that? Well, there's one idea, which is basically you just bury it. It turns out to be the really kind of the worst way to do it. I call that long isolation. Right now, they're encouraging people not to bury time capsules. The second one is cyclic isolation. There's a number of time capsules, including one built in Palo Alto recently, where you basically do the time capsule and you keep resurrecting it every generation or so, and then rebury it. There's parallel isolation time capsules, which is you bury more than one, and one of them stays visible and the other one is hidden. And that's also being done. And then there's non-isolation, which is basically you don't ever bury it. You just sort of stick it out like a monument, and everybody can see it, and it's labeled. And if it gets broken into whatever, at least you know where it is. So still there's a problem of how do you transmit this information over a long time. And the best idea that I've heard that some of the time capsules are using is you replicate the instructions. So the Westinghouse Decryptive Civilization, what they did is they printed up about 2,000 or 3,000 copies of a book, and the book described the contents of the time capsule and where it was. And again, they didn't assume anything. They assumed that maybe you didn't know how to find latitude and longitude, so the book would give instructions about how you determine that. It would give instructions of how you could triangulate over physical landmarks. And so they put these books into the Library of Congress. They sent actually some to monastery libraries, including some in Japan and Tibet, figuring that they would disperse the instructions around the world. Unfortunately, I have yet myself been able to find any of those books that were sent out. In fact, there was one study that did that out of the 2,000 books, there was only one copy of them left. Libraries throw books away. So here's the sequence of how you get into this. First, you have to find the book. You have to locate the capsule. So you need the instructions about how to find capsules. You need to learn English. You have to figure out the instructions, because some of these are microscopic, so you have to find a big lens, which are included in some of these. And one of them included lenses to read the book about how to build the reader. Okay, they told you how to assemble, how to make a movie projector. Then you need generic electricity, and then you need to read. So, what are some of the long-term information projects that we might do? Well, here are a couple examples of these. These are all kinds of projects that would take more than a decade to do. One of the questions is, how do we transmit data over long stretches of time? We don't know how to do that. One crazy idea is actually we can code information to DNA and have a little pool of self-replicating pond scum, which actually contains the Library of Congress. So that's one way to do that. Whole Net Internet Archive, this is a project that Brewster Kahle and people like Nathan Myhrvold have been thinking about. Let's take a picture of the internet and move it forward so that we have some sense of a time capsule to the future. I have two reasons why we might not want to do these long-term projects. One of them I blame on Nathan. He has very little to do with it, but he was first I heard about this. And this is the idea that some projects you don't really want to start now because the technology is getting so much better over time, so faster, that it doesn't make sense to start now. It actually makes sense to wait to do something later when the technology is better. That's one argument. The second one is called the butterfly effect out of the Kellyk story, which is that we can't predict the future. In fact, the future is so unpredictable it doesn't make any sense to start a 100-year project because we're just going to change our mind or it won't make any sense. It would be like trying to make, starting a 100-year project to build a huge blimp, which doesn't make sense now. But in any case, I think there are some 100-year plus projects that we could begin as a civilization to work on. And because of that, we have a group of us started something called the Clock Library. I have a couple more minutes, and then I'll be done. The Clock Library, the idea is to focus our attention onto long-term projects. And so we have some models of potential kind of building which would house both a clock and the library. And the clock is a clock that Danny Hillis has been talking about for a while. And this is a clock that ticks once a year, it talks once a century, and every 1,000 years a cuckoo or something comes out. And the idea of the clock is to instill in us a sense of like being at the edge of the Grand Canyon where we're looking and we're sort of awestruck by the sense of time. That's geological time. We want a clock like the picture of the whole Earth from space that sort of instills in us a sense of time and our place in it, in human time. And so the Clock Library is trying to make a mechanical digital clock designed by Danny Hillis. This is a digital clock that could be built with Bronze Age material that is the most accurate 10,000-year clock that we know could be built. It's done by the Long Now Foundation, which is right now consists of a bunch of people, some of them whose faces or names you might recognize. There's myself, there's Brian Eno, Paul Sappho, Danny Hillis, Doug Carlson from Broderbund, Peter Schwartz, and Stuart Brand from GBN. And missing from that is Esther Dyson and Mitch Kapoor, who helped founded the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We're interested in trying to foster long-term projects. If you're interested in that, contact us. We'd love to have you help us figure out what we should be doing. So thank you.